C.S. Lewis was a legendary, brilliant author who wrote across several genres: fantasy, Christian literature, and science fiction. Most people only know him as an accomplished author and apologist, perhaps best known for his Narnia books. But in this video, I hope you will learn how he encouraged soldiers fighting in the wars, converted many to Christianity, wrote amazing books, and overcame challenges to live an inspiring life. In this video, I hope to bring C.S. Lewis back to life in color and fascinate you with his journey. I am going to follow a timeline of the important points of his life and include pictures, dates, reenactments, and an interview with Lindsay Ponji, a professor of British literature. Enjoy the following timeline. 1898 through 1913, C.S. Lewis grew up at the estate of Little Lee in Northern Ireland. His mother died when he was only 9, and his father sent him away to Wynard boarding school in England. He hated it there due to other boys bullying him because his thumbs did not work properly. He wrote to his father about this, and he was sent to the countryside to live with a private tutor whose name was Kirkpatrick. He loved it there. Lewis liked to be called Jaxie as a kid after his dog. For his war life, we are going to go back in time and interview one of C.S. Lewis's commanders during World War I. Excuse me, sir. I tried to get here before your battle. Are you Sir General Douglas Haig?
Yes, I am.
Am I right that you commanded C.S. Lewis during World War I?
I did, and?
May I ask you a few questions about Lewis' service during the war?
Yes.
How did Lewis feel about the war?
He thought it was necessary, but he thought I was too cruel and devastating. He wrote a piece about it and called it a dreadful thing. In it, he described the horrors of war.
Where did he serve?
He was part of the front line in the trenches at Saint-Beuve, France, where I was commander.
Was he ever hurt?
He was brutally wounded by an exploding shell and barely made it to the ambulance. And then he recovered in the hospital. We then discharged him and he attended college.
Was he drafted?
He went to war on his own accord. Many describe him as a perfect example of a true loyalist to his country.
So, the soldiers need you. They say the battle has begun. Summertime, 1917. C.S. Lewis attended Oxford University, but guess what? Though he was skilled at literature and the arts, he failed his math test. However, they let him in because he had fought in World War I. Here's a clip from my interview with Dr. Lindsay Ponji, a professor of British literature. I will show pictures of Oxford as she talks.
Where he got his scholarship was called University College, and he studied there greats, which was in classic literature like Greek and Roman literature, and then he also studied English, so everything from Old English to Middle English to Renaissance English to modern English literature. He studied both those topics.
1925 to 1954. Lewis was a literature professor at Oxford University, and he lived at his home, the Kilns, with his brother Warnie. Between his job and writing, he spent time with J.R.R. Tolkien, who influenced him to become a Christian. Tolkien famously said that Christianity was a myth become fact. He would walk with Lewis at night around a beautiful trail at Oxford, Addison's Walk, and talk to him about Christianity. Lewis also encouraged the soldiers in World War II by broadcasting radio sermons. 1930s to late 1940s. The Inklings was a writers' club which was held at the Eagle and Child pub. Some members of it were C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams. The Inklings was meant to be a group to read and discuss the writer's stories. And on Thursdays, they met at Lewis's offices at Oxford, and on Tuesdays at the Eagle and Child, which they called the Bird and the Baby. Here's something you probably didn't know. J.R.R. Tolkien disapproved of C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories, saying they were too jumbled up. From 1936 to 1963, C.S. Lewis wrote books like Narnia, The Screwtape Letters, The Space Trilogy, and Mere Christianity. His Narnia series has sold over 100 million copies. To take a look at C.S. Lewis's marriage, we are going to go back in time and interview his wife, Joy Davidman. Excuse me, ma'am.
Can crumple space in a hollow cold.
Excuse me?
Oh, yes? Hi, I'm Joy Davidman. Nice to meet you.
I'm Julia Holtz. May I ask you a few questions about your relationship with C.S. Lewis?
Oh, sure. Fire away.
How did Lewis impact your life?
Well, I became a Christian thanks to him. He taught me about Jesus, and I was an atheist before, so I realized that I had been sinning my whole life.
How long were you two married?
Well, we were married in 1956, but sadly, I became sick, and then I recovered. We were able to take a honeymoon, but then I died in 1960. He did take good care of my boys afterwards.
You were both writers, correct?
Oh, yes. Jack wrote stories, and I wrote poetry, although I did write a couple books.
How did you two meet?
Well, I was living in America at the time as a poet, and I read some of his books. So I wrote to him, and then he wrote back to me. We began writing, and eventually we met, and we became great friends, and friendship turned into love, and then we were married.
Thank you for your time, ma'am.
No problem.
November 22nd, 1963. C.S. Lewis died the same day as President J.F. Kennedy and was buried at Holy Trinity Headington Quarry Church. This is his grave. Finally, here is a clip from Dr. Ponji about C.S. Lewis's legacy and impact on the next generation. How did his literature impact the next generation of writing?
Yeah, good question. So two major ways. He was one of these authors who wrote a lot of different types of books. Most authors, they'll write one type of book. They'll write a bunch of fantasy or something. He wrote the fantasy books like Chronicles of Narnia that you've read. He wrote some adult fantasy, like my favorite is called Till We Have Faces, where he did a retelling of a Greek myth of Psyche and Cupid. He wrote science fiction because he wrote the, Space Trilogy. And then he wrote a lot of books about Christian faith, like Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters, that would help people understand what is the gospel and how to believe it. So the two main impacts of all that writing are, one, he helped a lot of people understand the gospel and follow Jesus. And he still does today. People still read his writings and become Christians thanks to him. So that's a huge, awesome impact. But also, he and J.R.R. Tolkien are two of the most famous founders of fantasy literature. When they were writing Chronicles of Narnia and Lord of the Rings, if you went into a bookstore at that time, there was not a section that was called fantasy. In fact, that was like that fairy tales were a thing that were kind of for little kids, and they were in the nursery, and no one really cared or knew much about fantasy or fairy tales. But because of Tolkien and Lewis, they made this genre of fantasy become so popular because kids read Narnia and they're like, we want to read more books like Narnia. And so now bookstores, one of the biggest sections of bookstores is the fantasy section, right? And so his literature, his writing is what kind of inspired a lot of the fantasy and magic stories like Harry Potter. All of that is influenced by Lewis and Tolkien and their writing of the first, really good children's fantasy stories. Now everyone wants to read and write more fantasy stories. So that's another big impact.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because I see it in everything else. C.S. Lewis.